In a quiet corner of the Vatican Museum, he waits. Carved from marble, his beauty is eternal. His face, delicate, serene, almost divine, has watched the world change for nearly 2,000 years. His name is Antinous. You may not have heard of him. But in the ancient world, he was worshipped as a god. Entire cities bore his name. Poets sang his praises. Emperors wept at his tomb. And at the heart of it all was a love story. A story between a Roman emperor, Hadrian, powerful and brilliant, and a boy from the distant provinces of the empire. A love that defied tradition, stirred scandal, and left behind a mystery still unsolved to this day. What kind of love inspires the creation of over 2,000 statues? What kind of grief drives a Manan, emperor, to build a city for a boy lost too soon? And what kind of boy was Antinous, to be remembered not for what he did, but for who he was? This is not just a love story. It's a story about beauty, power, grief, and how memory can outlast even the greatest empire. Welcome to the forgotten world of Antinous and Hadrian. Let's begin. A gene being remembered not for what you said or what you did, but simply for being seen. That was Antinous. He wasn't a general. He didn't lead an army. He never ruled a province or wrote a book or gave a great speech in the Senate. And yet his face became one of the most recognizable in the ancient world. His name echoed across temples, coins, and marble statues from Egypt to Britain. Why? Because one day, a boy from a small town met the most powerful man in the world, and the world never forgot him. Antinous was born around the year 110 CE in a quiet city called Claudiopolis, in what is now modern-day Turkey. We don't know much about his early life, but historians believe he came from a relatively well-off family. He wasn't a slave. He wasn't royalty. He was something in between, ordinary in the eyes of history. But fate had other plans. Around the age of 12 or 13, he was chosen perhaps for his beauty, or perhaps by sheer coincidence, to be sent to Rome. He was likely enrolled in the pedagogium, a place where promising young boys were trained to serve in imperial households, and in one of history's quiet, life-altering turns, that's where he caught the eye of Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian was a complex man, fierce, philosophical, deeply intelligent. When he looked at Antinous, something shifted. He was traveling the empire, side by side with the emperor, visiting temples, hunting lions, tending feasts, sailing the Nile. A bond formed, one that transcended status, language, even age. Antinous would become more than a court companion. He would become Hadrian's confidant, and something far more intimate. Soon, Antinous was no longer just a boy from Bithynia. And just like that, he became someone whose very presence shaped the course of history. Sometimes our lives take on meaning not through our own ambition, but through the roles we come to play in the lives of others. For Antinous, being truly seen by someone powerful gave him a place in history no one could have predicted. And yet, fame has its cost. Antinous would be remembered for centuries. But he would not live to see his 20th birthday. The boy who once stood beside an emperor would soon be mourned like a god. But how did this boy from the edges of the empire become divine? And what did his relationship with Hadrian truly look like behind the marble, the myths, and the mystery? Let's step deeper into their story. He was not your typical Roman emperor. While others chased military glory, Hadrian was chasing meaning. Hadrian, full name Publius alias Hadrianus, was born in 76 CE in what is now Spain. From a young age, he was different. Where many future rulers learned the art of war, Hadrian immersed himself in Greek philosophy, architecture, and poetry. He loved books more than battles and statues more than swords. In fact, the Romans often called him Greculus, the little Greek, because of his deep fascination with Hellenistic culture. He didn't mind the nickname. He wore it like a quiet badge of pride. He could be a hard ruler, yes. He could issue harsh punishments and demand absolute loyalty. But beneath the surface was a deeply introspective man. One who thought constantly about death, destiny, and the soul. Hadrian didn't just want to rule Rome. He wanted to understand it, shape it, even heal it. He spent more time traveling through his empire than sitting on a throne. While many emperors preferred power to people, Hadrian preferred presence. He wanted to see his provinces, to walk their streets, to meet their citizens. And then he saw him. A young boy from BathinaBrida.com curious. In ancient Rome, especially among elites, relationships between older men and younger boys were not uncommon. But Hadrian's bond with Antinous was different. Hadrian was married to Vibia Sabina, a noble woman of high rank. But their relationship was distant, more political than romantic. In private, Hadrian's affections leaned elsewhere. He had known male lovers before. It wasn't fleeting, wasn't secret. It was sincere, consuming, and constant. He didn't just desire Antinous. He adored him. He took him everywhere, gave him education, comfort, freedom. He trusted him perhaps more than he trusted his own advisors. One Roman writer would later describe Antinous as the only person Hadrian truly loved. In a world built on conquest, Hadrian's greatest act of courage may have been vulnerability. He allowed himself to love, not behind closed doors, but openly, fully, even defiantly. Even the most powerful among us seek someone who sees them. It's not as emperor, not as god, but simply as human. For Hadrian, Antinous became that mirror, that sanctuary. It's that rare kind of connection that can't be forced, only found. Love in Rome, or anywhere else, is rarely simple, especially when it travels. And Hadrian, the ever-curious emperor, was always on the move. He and Antinous would spend the next few years not in palaces, but on the road, exploring, discovering, dreaming. So where did this emperor and his beloved go? What did they see, and how did their shared journey draw them closer? Let's carry them toward tragedy. Let's follow their footsteps. Love rarely arrives with fanfare. More often, it slips in quietly in a glance, a gesture, a moment so small you almost miss it. We don't know the exact moment when Hadrian first met Antinous. There is no diary, no record of their first words. But somewhere between the stone halls of imperial Rome and the green hills of Greece, a spark was lit. Hadrian was a man of intellect, nearing middle age. Antinous was still a boy, quiet, observant, unshaped by politics or ambition. And yet Hadrian noticed him. Not for what he said, not for what he accomplished, but for something harder to define. A kind of presence, stillness, mystery. In Antinous, Hadrian saw youth, yes, but also grace. The kind of beauty that the Greeks once wrote poems about. And maybe, in that boy, he saw a version of himself before the wars, the throne, the weariness. What began as companionship soon deepened. Hadrian brought Antinous into his inner circle not as a servant, but as a trusted presence. They read philosophy together. They walked in silence through groves of olive trees. They visited temples side by side, always in step. Let's pause for a moment. This was Rome, after all. A world of strict hierarchies, public image, and political theater. Same-sex relationships weren't unusual in the ancient world, but they came with rules. Had statues made while the boy was still alive, an act almost unheard of for someone outside the imperial bloodline. Older men could pursue younger boys, yes, but it was expected to be brief, one-sided, and discreet. Love, however mutual, emotional, visible, was different, riskier, more radical. Hadrian didn't care. He brought Antinous on official visits, gave him visible honor. People whispered. Senators frowned. But Hadrian was emperor, and emperors do not ask for permission. It's easy centuries later to romanticize this as a perfect love story. But their world was one of imbalance, of power and silence, of admiration and expectation.
Ow.
And perhaps that's what makes it so haunting. Hadrian had everything. Antinous had only Hadrian. Was it love? Was it devotion? Or was it something in between, something more fragile and unspoken? Here's what we do know. Wherever Hadrian went, Antinous followed. Not as an ornament, but as a companion, a witness. The emperor didn't just love him, he needed him. Love that crosses boundaries of class, of age, of power has always existed. And it has always walked a tightrope. Between admiration and control, freedom and fate, theirs was a love the world wasn't ready to name, but it shaped both their destinies. And like many intense loves, it needed space to grow. It's not within marble walls or Roman courts, but out in the world. So Hadrian did what he did best. He left the capital. And with Antinous by his side, he began to roam again. What does it mean to walk the world with someone you love? To share not just a bed but landscapes, cultures, and time itself? Let's travel with them through temples and deserts, mountains and myths, and see how this forbidden love unfolded across the empire. Love doesn't always grow in stillness. Sometimes it needs movement, a road, a river, a map with no fixed destination. For Hadrian and Antinous, love meant motion. They didn't stay behind palace walls, moved together. Across the vast and varied lands of the Roman Empire, they walked through the marble columns of Athens, where Hadrian, a lover of Greek culture, rebuilt temples and funded libraries. He taught Antinous about Socrates and Plato, not in lecture halls, but as they walked the city's streets at dusk, listening to the sounds of the agora. They visited Ephesus, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Cities alive with noise, color, language. Hadrian often met with governors and generals, but Antinous stayed close, not out of duty, but as something quieter. A steady presence, a pair of eyes that understood him without words. Can you imagine it? I'm being young, unknown, and suddenly walking beside the most powerful man in the world, not as his servant, but as his shadow, his confidant. In Alexandria, they stood together at the mouth of the Nile, watching the stars over Egypt. This was a place where gods had once walked among pharaohs. Here, perhaps for the first time, Antinous felt not like a visitor, but like he belonged to something larger than himself. Hadrian, ever the architect, didn't just bring buildings to life. He brought Antinous to life by showing him the world. And Antinous, in return, gave Hadrian something far rarer than obedience. He gave him wonder, the chance to see his empire not as a ruler, but as a man in love. Because here's the thing about love and travel. When you move through the world with someone, you begin to see differently. You see how sand in Egypt feels different than in Spain, how olive oil in Athens tastes brighter than in Rome, how laughter in a foreign tongue still reaches the heart. It's easy to think of emperors as distant, untouchable. But on the road, Hadrian became human. Not Caesar Augustus. Just a man with tired feet, sunburnt shoulders, and someone he loved walking beside him. In every city, Antinous saw Hadrian praised like a god. But in private moments, he saw the man behind the laurel wreath, the sleepless nights, the doubts, the dreams unspoken. And that's where their love lived. Not in gold statues or marble halls, but in those quiet moments between destinations. There's a lesson here, simple but rare. Sometimes the deepest love isn't loud or dramatic. It's just being there, mile after mile, day after day. Their travels took them south, finally, to the land of ancient gods and endless waters, Egypt. They would float together down the Nile, watching the reeds sway, the ibis fly, and the pyramids stand still against time. It should have been a celebration, a new chapter. But what happened next would change everything. The Nile has carried life for thousands of years. But one October night, it carried something else. A loss so profound it would echo across centuries. Let's turn to that night. Let's ask, what happened to Antinous? And why even now we still don't know. It should have been just another night on the river. The sky above them wide and clear. The Nile calm as polished glass. The boat drifting gently past reeds that whispered like ancient voices. But by dawn, Antinous was gone. They were in Egypt, the final stretch of their long journey. Hadrian was unwell, plagued by a mysterious illness that no physician could cure. He had come to Egypt, as many did, seeking healing from its ancient gods. And Antinous was by his side, as always. They attended sacred festivals, made offerings at temples, consulted priests in Hermopolis, where the god Thoth was believed to hold wisdom and secrets. Everything seemed ordinary, till it wasn't. On October 30th, 130 CE, Antinous drowned in the Nile, just days before his 20th birthday. Months before they were to return to Rome. No one saw it happen. No one ever truly explained it. And so the river didn't just swallow a life. It swallowed the truth. The ancient world was full of rumors, and Antinous' death sparked many. Some said it was an accident that he slipped, or misjudged the river's depth. Others believed it was suicide, that Antinous, growing older, feared losing Hadrian's favor in a world obsessed with youth. But the most haunting theory? That it was a sacrifice. Hadrian, after all, was desperate for healing. He believed deeply in magic, omens, divine exchanges, and the Nile was not just a river. It was sacred, tied to the god Osiris, who had himself died and been reborn. Could Antinous have given himself, willingly, to save the man he loved? We'll never know what truly happened that night, because the one person who could tell us was lost to the water. What we do know is this: Hadrian was shattered. This wasn't the grief of a ruler. It was the grief of a man who had lost his heart. He would never be the same, and neither would the world. And so we're left with a lesson quiet and painful, that love, even the deepest, cannot always hold back the tide, that some stories end before we're ready. And sometimes the only way we know how much someone mattered is by what's left behind when they're gone. But Hadrian didn't just mourn Antinous. He did something far more enduring, something only an emperor could do. He immortalized him. He turned his grief into marble, into myth, into godhood. So what happens when a boy is gone, but his image still stands in temples? When a lover dies, but becomes divine, let's see how grief became glory. Let's explore the legacy of the boy who drowned and rose again. How do you mourn someone when the world is watching?
Ow!
How do you say goodbye when the person you've lost meant everything? Hadrian had the power of an empire, but in the face of Antinous' death, he was just a man in mourning, turned into something the world had never seen before. In the weeks after Antinous' body disappeared beneath the Nile, Hadrian made a stunning decision. He declared Antinous would become a god. This wasn't symbolic. Hadrian literally ordered the creation of a new deity. He founded a city on the banks of the Nile where Antinous had died and called it Antinopolis, the city of Antinous. He filled it with temples, processions, games, priests. Coins were minted in the boy's image. Shrines were built across Greece, Egypt, and Asia Minor. Over 2,000 statues of Antinous were erected, more than almost any figure in Roman history, except for the emperors themselves. Some saw it as scandalous, others as madness. But for Hadrian, it was sacred. This wasn't just about beauty or legacy. Hadrian had been fascinated by rebirth myths, especially that of Osiris, the Egyptian god who died and rose again. He saw Antinous the same way, a young man taken too soon, who could live on, not in flesh, but in memory, in myth, in marble. And it worked. For centuries, people worshipped Antinous. They prayed to him for healing. They offered him flowers, songs, hopes. He became more than a lover, more than a companion. He became an idea, a symbol of youth, beauty, devotion, and something even deeper: love remembered. There's a quiet truth here. Is that to love someone deeply is to keep part of them alive, not just in shrines or cities, but in the stories we tell, in the way we remember. Hadrian never stopped grieving, but he gave the world a way to grieve with him. And in doing so, he made sure Antinous was never forgotten. But grief has its shadows. Not everyone welcomed the cult of Antinous. In the years that followed, something remarkable happened. This once unknown boy, worshipped as a god, began to rival the rising figure of another, a carpenter from Nazareth named Jesus. So how did Antinous, mortal youth, become one of the most popular gods of his time? And why did early Christians see him as a threat? Let's step into the twilight of the empire, when faiths collided and legends competed for eternity. In the years after his death, Antinous didn't fade into legend. He rose temple by temple, city by city, until the world began to whisper his name like a prayer. It began along the Nile, but it didn't stay there. The cult of Antinous spread across the Roman Empire. From the busy streets of Athens to the quiet corners of Gaul, people called him many names. Antinous the Beautiful, Antinous the Divine, Antinous Osiris, healer, savior, the youth who died and rose again. Yes, rose again, because the story that Hadrian shaped and that people clung to was not just of a tragic death, but of rebirth. In Egypt, Antinous was seen as the new Osiris, a god of the afterlife, reborn from water. In Greece, he was likened to Dionysus, the young god of passion, ecstasy, and resurrection. And in Rome, he was something else entirely, a symbol of beauty made eternal. But the most surprising thing, his cult was popular. It's not just among elites, but among ordinary people, sailors, farmers, artisans. Why? Because Antinous wasn't a god of thunder or war. He wasn't unreachable. He had been one of them, a young man, fragile and mortal, who died young, just like so many of their own sons and brothers. But unlike them, he came back in stone, in ritual and belief. Prayers were whispered to him before journeys, offerings left for healing, statues kissed in private moments of grief. And as the decades passed, some began to believe he might one day return. It was a time when gods were shifting. As Christianity quietly grew in catacombs and homes, so too did the light around Antinous. In fact, early Christian writers like Church Father Tertullian warned against the cult of Antinous. They saw it not as a quaint obsession, but a rival. Why? Because the story sounded familiar. A beloved figure who dies young, who is mourned deeply, rises again, who is worshipped as a savior. Too many Romans, Antinous was their Christ. So what do we learn from this strange echo of faiths? That human beings across time and culture are drawn to stories of loss and hope, of beauty lost too soon, but not gone. And that grief, when it's shared, can become something enduring, even something divine, but nothing lasts forever. And as Christianity gained favor in the empire and new emperors took power, the temples of Antinous fell silent. One by one, the statues were toppled, shrines were abandoned. His name, once whispered in candlelight, was forgotten by the world. So what happened to the boy who became a god? And how did time almost erase him? Until someone began to dig. Let's turn now to the fall of a legacy and its quiet rediscovery. Not all gods fade in fire. Some simply grow quiet. For nearly 2 centuries after his death, Antinous was everywhere. His image stood in marble gardens, temple halls, private homes. His name was spoken with reverence. His story of beauty, love, and loss was carried from mother to daughter, from teacher to child. But time has its own gods. And one by one, the altars of Antinous began to fall. The Roman Empire was changing. By the late 4th century, a new faith had taken center stage, Christianity. Now not just a belief, but the official religion of the empire. With Emperor Theodosius I came a sweeping ban. All pagan cults, no matter how personal, how peaceful, were outlawed. Temples were shut, statues destroyed, books burned, rituals silenced. And Antinous, he disappeared almost overnight. No armies came for him, no dramatic last stand, just silence and forgetting. Antinopolis, once a thriving city in Egypt, fell into ruin. Its streets grew wild with weeds. Its sacred halls used for stone or buried under sand. Shrines to Antinous in Greece and Italy were abandoned. His name was removed from records. His followers vanished into history. Only a handful of his many statues survived, hidden, buried, or misidentified for centuries. And yet in small ways, the memory lingered. Artists in the Renaissance painted anonymous boys with the same soft curls. Statue mislabeled as Apollo was quietly admired for centuries, until one day someone asked, who was he really? And maybe there's a lesson here. And that beauty, like love, can be forgotten, but never entirely lost. Time may cover the face, but the shape remains beneath, waiting to be found. For 1,500 years, the world forgot Antinous. But the 19th century brought something unexpected: archaeology. As the earth was dug and ruins uncovered, his face began to emerge again. One statue here, a coin there. A name carved faintly in Greek, and slowly his story returned. Not as a god, perhaps, but as something just as powerful, a memory. What do we owe to those who came before? Even if their gods are gone, even if their names were erased, their stories still whisper. The fall of Antinous wasn't a betrayal. It was the quiet pause between remembering and rediscovering. And now, after centuries in silence, his image returns in museums, in books, in conversations like this one. But how exactly did we find him again? Let's travel next. To the moment his face emerged from the dirt and a forgotten boy stepped back into the light. For centuries, Antinous was a name the world no longer knew. But the earth never forgets. It began with dust, a brushstroke, glint of marble beneath ancient soil. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as archaeologists began to unearth the ruins of the Roman world, they kept finding him again and again. Some called the statue Apollo, others guessed Hermes. But something didn't quite fit. Features were too soft, too human, too mournful. And then someone found a name, etched faintly beneath the chin. Alpha Nu Tau, Iota Nu Omicron, Omicron Sigma. One statue became 5, then 50, then over 100. Today, museums across the world, the Vatican, the Louvre, the British Museum, Berlin's Alts Museum, each house a version of Antinous, each one slightly different, it unmistakably him. It was like watching a soul piece itself back together. One fragment, one temple ruin, one faded coin at a time. But the rediscovery didn't stop with stone. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, scholars began revisiting Hadrian's letters, the writings of Cassius Dio, the scattered mentions in ancient poetry. Artists, especially those in the Romantic and pre-Raphaelite movements, began painting Antinous again. Not as a god, not even as a legend, but as something more intimate, a boy who once was. And in the 20th century, something else happened. Quiet and beautiful. Queer communities, long denied representation in history, began to reclaim Antinous as one of their own. It's not just a symbol of beauty, but of memory, love, of a story that mattered, even if the world once tried to erase it. So what do we learn from all this? That the past isn't dead. It's just waiting for someone to look closer, to listen, to ask the right question. Antinous may have vanished from altars, but he rose again in archives, in museums, in the hearts of those who saw in him not a god, but a mirror. Because when we uncover forgotten faces, we're not just restoring statues, we're restoring selves. Those who were silenced, erased, or simply misunderstood. And when we do, we make space for everyone, past or present, to be seen. But Antinous' story doesn't end with marble or museums. He has outlived empires, religions, kings, and today people still ask, why does he matter? What does his story mean? Now, let's end this journey by looking not to the past, but to the meaning that still echoes in the present. He died over 1,800 years ago. But Antinous is still here, in statues and stories, and in the hearts of those who see something of themselves in him. Why does he still matter? After all, Antinous wasn't a general, he wasn't a writer. He left behind no words, no battles, no treatises. He was just a boy from a forgotten town, who happened to be loved by one of the most powerful men in the world. And yet, he became something more. Today, artists still sculpt him. Writers still invoke his name in poetry and prose. Queer communities honor him as a symbol of visibility and loss. Historians study him to understand the way love and politics intertwined in ancient Rome. He has become a bridge between the ancient world and ours, between private grief and public memory. In 2021, the LGBTQ+ Museum in Berlin featured Antinous as part of an exhibit on queer history and antiquity. In 2015, a marble bust of him was placed on display at the British Museum, framed not just as art, but as a story. A life cut short, a love made immortal, a question left unanswered. And that may be what keeps drawing us back to Antinous. He reminds us that not every legacy is loud. Some endure in whispers. In the gentle curve of a statue's cheek, in the silence between historical lines, in the faces of those who have loved but could never say it out loud. We remember Antinous because he gives form to feelings that have often gone unspoken. Love that wasn't allowed, grief that had no name, beauty that faded too soon, but still asked to be remembered. Antinous doesn't need to be a god anymore. He just needs to be remembered. So here we are at the end of a story. But not really the end, because Antinous lives on. In museums, in history, in us. In every person who's ever felt out of place but still worthy of love. And maybe, if memory is its own kind of immortality, then Antinous is still very much alive. To be remembered is to remain.